Right, if we can get situated, please. Mr. Rose, are you?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I apologize. May I, just one quick order of business. I just want to let the board know that Dory Richards is available remotely, if necessary.
Dory Richards. Oh, okay, yes, all right.
Mr. Hearing Officer, Ms. Olson is going to conduct the examination of Mr. Salente.
Okay. Are you just going to call Mr. Salente, or are you also going to call Mr. Cohen?
We're not doing a panel. We're going to call Mr. Salente first, and then when his examination is concluded, we'll call our second witness.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Salente. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding? Ms. Olson, you may proceed.
Good evening, Mr. Salente. Can you please state and spell your name for the court reporter?
Sure. Michael, Michael, Celente, Celente. Excuse me.
And what is your current profession?
I serve as a managing consultant for Trinity Consultants here in Albuquerque.
And Mr. Celente, have you prepared pre-filed written technical testimony for this hearing?
Yes, it should be docket 183, and the exhibits are 1, 2, and then the expert report is exhibit 5.
And so I believe your written direct testimony is exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 to the NOI is your resume. And you mentioned an expert report. Was that expert report prepared by you under your direction?
Yes, so the expert report was prepared by me and then co-authored by my colleague, Scott Cohen, who's another witness.
And Mr. Celente, is the pre-filed written direct technical testimony that you submitted in the expert report true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And if you were asked the same questions in your written direct testimony under oath, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Celente, can you please briefly summarize your relevant experience and education?
Yeah, sure. So I live here in Albuquerque, resident of Bernalillo County. I live in the South Valley. And I have been with Trinity Consultants since grad school. And so what I do there really is permitting in and day out. My expertise is specifically in New Mexico. So between the New Mexico Environment Department, Air Quality Bureau, and the Bernalillo County Environmental Health Department, I've prepared probably well over 150 permits. Along with that, I've done compliance auditing, audited over 100 facilities in the state of New Mexico, including Bernalillo County. Also have extensive experience in control technology evaluation, as well as compliance with regulatory language and permits. So helping clients to comply with what their permits mean from a monitoring, record keeping, and reporting standpoint. Yeah, I would say that's most of my relevant experience. And besides that, being a resident of New Mexico, I'm very familiar with the industry that's in here, as well as the types of facilities in the county.
And Mr. Celente, can you elaborate a little bit on what preparing a permit for a client entails?
Yeah, sure. So it's a pretty involved process. There's a lot of different components that go into it. The first thing that really goes into it is going to be the characterization of emissions, right? So what type of source is it, and what are the primary pollutants, whether they're criteria pollutants or hazardous air pollutants. Once we've kind of characterized those, we have to use emission factors or the best data available to figure out what the potential emissions are for that source. Based on those potential emissions, we figure out what the permitting path is. Does it require just an AQN or source registration? Is it a construction permit? Does it require a Title V or PSD permit? So those are kind of the initial questions. Once we go through that, then we do the specifics of what the actual application requires in terms of the forms, public notice, air dispersion modeling, kind of all of those requirements, if you will. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of those if that would be helpful.
And Mr. Celente, is part of your permitting work for clients, do you also prepare budgets for the cost of the work in putting together the permit application? Yeah,
so that's the first thing we do is once we have a potential facility or a modification proposed to a facility, we go through an analysis and say, you know, based on what you're proposing and our expertise, we're going to say it's going to cost X number of dollars based on however many hours are associated with that level. So there are instances, for example, where modeling may be waived for a certain application. And so that won't be as obviously resource intensive.
And you mentioned you've prepared pre-filed written direct testimony as well as a report. That information is fully available in the record, but for the benefit of the board, could you please just summarize the key opinions in your expert report?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of items that I really want to highlight. So the first is the current permitting requirements here in Albuquerque and what are covered under those. The second would be a detailed discussion of air dispersion modeling. We've heard from a couple of technical experts about their experience, but I would like to talk a little bit about what that looks like here in New Mexico, because I think that's an important foundation in the county. And then the cost implications for both the EHD as well as for applicants who are going through this process. So for the first one, I'm going to refer to 20.11 quite often. And so I'm just going to refer to, for example, part 39 as opposed to saying all of that. So right now.
To interrupt, could you just say for the record what 20.11, what you're referring to?
Oh, yeah. So that would be the New Mexico Administrative Code, 20 being, I believe, the title, and then 11 is the specific requirements for air quality in Bernalillo County. So the first thing I want to talk about is the purview of kind of what we permit. And so that's stationary sources. And so I'll ask them to show one of the graphs, or excuse me, the pie charts from our expert report. So this is Exhibit 5. So this is based on 2020 National Emission Inventory data. And why I think this is important is because for the county characterization, you can see that over 50% of the total emissions come from mobile sources. So they're classified there as, I believe, off-highway and highway vehicles. This characterization actually changes for the state as a whole. So if you were to look at the state of New Mexico, it would be about 10% come from mobile sources. So you may be familiar with parts of the state like the Southeast or Northwest, where, for example, oil and gas is a very heavy industry. That's not what Bernalillo County looks like in terms of the characterization of our emission sources. So why I think that's important is because if we look kind of at the different types of stationary sources in the county, and this is going to be the next image, it's on page 55. So this is what the current characterization of emissions sources looks like that are permitted. So under Part 39, we have something called an air quality notification, or an AQN. That's for sources of emissions that are primarily emergency generators and gasoline dispensing facilities. If you look, I think I wrote this down, 362 emergency generators and 184 gasoline dispensing facilities. The next step above that is something called a source registration. And so that's for any source that has more than 2,000 pounds or 1 ton per year of emissions and any hazardous air pollutants. The total for that is 355 in the county. So then we look under our different types of minor NSR and synthetic NSR permits. So these are the ones that have Part 41 permits. And you can see that number is roughly around 200 if you sum those up. So I think this is important is we have about 1,100 sources on this map, and 900 of them are stationary sources that are not under the purview of the proposed rule. So this rule only applies to Part 41, which is those construction permit sources. It applies to Part 60, which is non-attainment sources, and then Part 61, which is prevention of significant deterioration. There's 3 PSD sources in Bernalillo County. I think that's also an important important point to note, because a lot of the control technologies that are proposed are typically only reserved for either non-attainment areas or PSD permits. So when we talk about the regulation, I think it's important to consider what is covered under it. The next thing I want to talk about specifically is the air dispersion modeling requirements and what a typical analysis looks like as part of a permitting application. So the first step, kind of like when we do a permit application, is to determine what the actual emission calculations are and what the source is emitting, both in terms of all criteria pollutants and all hazardous air pollutants. Once we have that information, the next step is kind of building what we call a baseline model. So we'll put in, as you heard earlier, meteorological data. We'll call that MET data. There's also inputs related to what type of source? Is it a point source, so like a stack, or is an area source or a volume source, which are how we represent things like stockpiles or haul roads, which aren't necessarily coming from a stack. After we go through that process, there's some other inputs, but the main focus is the first thing we do is complete what's called a significant impact analysis, where we compare to significant impact levels. And so these are levels set that if the project that's proposed or the modification results in modeled concentrations that are below this threshold, we don't have to consider cumulative impacts. It's basically the assumption that the facility is not going to contribute or result in an exceedance of any standard. If we are above that threshold, the next step would be what we call a cumulative impact analysis. As a result of that analysis, what we do is take the facility's contributions, we add a background concentration based on a monitor that is geographically located as close as possible to the facility or representative. And then we also, from the EHD, receive surrounding sources, which are added to the model. So as an example, the PM 2.5 standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, is 12 micrograms per meter cubed. There's 5 different PM monitors in the county. So there's one in the foothills, North Valley, South Valley, Jefferson, and Del Norte High School. So if we were doing a modeling project in the South Valley, for example, that background concentration is 9.1 micrograms per meter cubed. I think the foothills monitor is 5.1 micrograms per meter cubed. And the standard is 12, right? So that leaves the facility plus any surrounding sources 0.9 micrograms per meter cubed to consume in terms of the actual incremental increase, or else it won't pass any of the modeling standards. And so those sources and those background concentrations are provided and updated by the EHD. And the background concentrations are meant to reflect surrounding sources, but also background levels of pollutants. One of the key distinctions between the New Mexico Environment Department and the Bernalillo County EHD is that NMED has taken the stance that for certain pollutants and averaging periods, so for example, 1 hour NO2, you can add 1 hour nitrogen dioxide, sorry. Yeah, NO2, yeah. Yeah, I'll make more work for you to type it all out. I'm just kidding. Yeah, so 1 hour NO2 or nitrogen dioxide standard. And so what we do is the NMED will allow you to either use a background concentration or surrounding sources. The EHD requires you to use both. And their point of view is that the Del Norte NO2 monitor basically only takes into account background concentration from mobile sources. So that value is 84.6 and the standard is 188. So that leaves a facility a little bit more room there, but still you have to add in the surrounding sources as well as a background. And that's done for every single pollutant and every single averaging period. Let's see. The next thing that I wanted to talk about specifically is, I don't think this has been addressed before, is kind of the impacts on the actual environmental health department. So if you go to the next page, 67. Okay, so what I did here, there's been a lot of references in the proposed rules and in technical testimony to other jurisdictions. And so what this does is it looks at different agencies, it looks at their budgets, and it looks at their full-time equivalents in terms of who's employed under the purview of that agency. So the two I want to point out, because they've been mentioned quite a bit, are Bay Area and South Coast. And right below that, you can see the Environmental Health Department's budget. So EHD has a budget of 4.3 million. Bay Area has a budget, I believe, it's kind of hard to see from here. I think it's 270. And then South Coast is about 200 million. The important thing to note is it would not be appropriate to compare those directly just because the population and resources are different. So what we've done is basically taken the population that board or agency is responsible for, and then develop numbers on a per capita basis. In other words, if you had a budget of 200 million, if you were to divide that by 17 million, you would get the value that you see in the furthest column to your right. And the main takeaway here is that all of these agencies that are implementing these programs have budgets and staffs on a per capita basis that are much higher than what EHD has right now. So there are severe kind of implications to the kind of, if this rule were to be implemented on an agency that is already overburdened and has issues meeting its current regulatory commitments. They are going through the process of trying to hire more staff, but right now permits can take anywhere from 7 to 9 months to be issued. By comparison, depending on the permitting path, the New Mexico Environment Department can issue a permit in 30 days. So I think that's an important distinction to make. The last thing I kind of want to focus on is the costs that would be kind of incurred in terms of compliance. So if you go to the next page, 68. So as Carrie mentioned, in my role, one of my primary kind of things that I do is when a potential client comes, say they have, and this happens a lot, facilities in a different state, they'll come and say, hey, we're proposing a facility in New Mexico or in Bernalillo County. Can you give us some cost estimates in terms of what it would look like if we were to permit that facility here? And so right now in the county, you can see it's about $25,000 to $75,000 to go through that process. Everything in table 3 that you see there is something that's going to be additional as proposed by this HEEI rule. The reason that there's cost variability is over the past few days, we've seen there's a lot of discussions about how this would be implemented, what's been involved in the process, what should be included in unmitigated versus mitigated modeling. And so there's going to be some level of uncertainty there based on the fact there's no implementation guidance or kind of detailed information about how this would be or how this should be implemented by EHD. So earlier, I believe Dr. Clark said that this would be kind of a de minimis impact in terms of the additional effects for an applicant, but doing this for a living, I disagree strongly with that. So the first one, that technology evaluation, there's 3 different types that are mentioned in the rule. So we call them LAER, L-A-E-R, lowest achievable emission rate, BACT, or BACT, best available control technology, and then RACT, which is reasonably available control technology. So BACT right now only applies to major sources, so PSD major sources that are proposing a modification or initial PSD sources. Like I mentioned, there's only 3 of those in the county. So we don't really do much BACT here in the county because it's not required. The second 2, or the other ones that I'll mention, are LAER and RACT. So those only apply to non-attainment areas. Bernalillo County is currently in attainment for all pollutants and standards and averaging periods. So we don't do LAER or RACT in Bernalillo County. There's only one small area of actually the state of New Mexico in general that's in non-attainment, and that's down in Doña Ana County. So the level of effort for a control technology evaluation basically includes the first thing you do is identify the source and then all applicable control technologies that could be used to control that source and specific pollutant. The second step is a feasibility analysis. Is that technology technically feasible or infeasible? This third step involves ranking that based on its control effectiveness. So the higher the control or reduction in emissions, the higher rank it receives. The fourth is a cost analysis and also includes energy and other impacts. And then step 5 is you eventually choose the limit. So that has to be done for every single pollutant, for every single averaging period, for any source as proposed under the rule, depending on what the overburden criteria is. So it's a pretty involved process. So that's kind of the ones that I wanted to highlight. My colleague, Scott Cohen, has direct experience with the cancer risk and hazard risk assessment. So he can kind of tackle those items. But yeah, those are kind of the overall high level items I wanted to highlight.
Thank you. And you mentioned several times in your direct testimony that at the time you prepared that testimony, petitioners had not yet provided or made available technical information supporting their proposal. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, so I would say there may have been some technical documentation in the docket, but in terms of the support that we've seen in the NOIs, that was the first time that I saw that.
And have you reviewed the NOI notice of intent with the testimony and exhibits that were filed by petitioners?
Yes.
And have you also reviewed the NOI with testimony and exhibits that was filed by community interveners in support of the rule?
Yes.
Did you file written rebuttal responding to those written direct testimonies?
Yes. I think it was docket 218, and that would be exhibit 6.
Can you please summarize the key points from your written rebuttal testimony?
Yeah, so I do not generally disagree with a lot of the broad conclusions that some of the technical experts presented, right? So the impact of air pollution on communities, the health risk assessment process or things like that. What I'm still concerned about is specific technical evidence that is in support of the proposed rule. And I think that's where a lot of my rebuttal kind of goes into a bit more detail. So for example, version 4 of the proposed rule included a map. I think it was Dr. Bilsbeck's figure 4. And then version 6, what was that, docket 200, has a new definition of overburdened community in a different map. So some of my concerns are around the fact that between those two versions, there was an additional technical justification for why certain communities were no longer included as overburdened or why new ones were brought in. And to me, that kind of would suggest that it's an arbitrary kind of definition. And
have you been present over the past 3 days for petitioner's presentation of its proposal?
Yes.
And the community intervener's presentation of its testimony supporting petitioner's proposal?
Yes.
And do you have rebuttal to the additional testimony that petitioners and community interveners witnesses have presented on this stand?
I would say there's a few things. So the first is that mobile sources are brought up a lot in technical testimony. And as you saw, mobile sources are a primary source of pollution in the county, but they're not regulated by this rule. The other thing that I would say is that Dr. Clark, there were some discussions about unmitigated versus mitigated modeling and what would that mean. And I think those discussions and the fact that there was such a need for clarification and cross-examination would suggest that there still needs to be a lot of work in terms of what that looks like. For those of us who do air quality for a living, we know that any ambiguity or any gray area is really an issue in terms of how we can consult our clients, how EHD can enforce something, and what that ends up looking like at the end of the day once it goes into effect, if it does.
And Mr. Salenti, to just wrap up, in your review of the totality of the evidence that's been presented, both written and on the stand, have you seen any technical testimony or analysis demonstrating the anticipated impact of petitioner's proposal on air quality in Albuquerque or Bernalillo County?
The impact, I would say no. And
in your expert opinion, will the regulation that's being proposed by petitioners have an impact on existing air quality in Albuquerque or Bernalillo County?
I would say no, and this is why. The proposed rule as written does not do anything for existing sources unless they go through a modification that's an emissions increase. And it only applies to new sources. It also does not apply to mobile sources, air quality notifications, or source registrations, which all have, as presented earlier, there's a large quantity of those which undoubtedly have an impact on the airshed. None of those are addressed in this rule.
Thank you. With that, I tender Mr. Salente to the board and other participants for cross-examination and questioning.
I would expect that there's some questions from the board. It's 7:30. I'm not sure if the board wants to get started with some questioning and then take a break at your pleasure.
How do you feel? I know I have a lot of questions that I'd love to get started with. Do other folks have questions?
I've got
As I'm
questions.
sure I will let other folks go first, even though I desperately want to go first.
Well, I'm wondering if we can just hold off maybe until, because I also have a lot of questions. And I'm really
No, go ahead.
foggy right now.
Well,
So if somebody else wants to ask, I'd rather wait till tomorrow.
All
Will
right.
your,
I don't.
Okay, Dennis, you do yours, I'll do mine. We'll go down the line.
Mine's pretty simple. You've heard the testimony today and you said it yesterday too. Do you believe that there are overburdened communities in the Bernalillo County area?
I think there are, but I think it's important for us to have a technical basis for determining how those communities are defined as overburdened.
Okay, and that's what I want to hear from you. Then in your opinion, what would you do to mitigate this problem?
So I think one of the questions, and I think Dr. Clark proposed this at first, is he said the entire county is overburdened if you look at ozone pollution, for example, right? And so I think there needs to be an approach where we look at a lot of these different impacts. But as the rule is proposed right now, as a resident of Albuquerque, it basically would prioritize certain communities that I don't think would need as much prioritization because it's too generic and not necessarily focused on, I would say, specific communities based on the definition as proposed. So I think if we're going to get into a definition of overburdened community, it doesn't really make sense to have a majority of the county defined as overburdened because it makes it more difficult to focus on the areas that truly may be burdened based on a definition.
And so would this mean lowering the thresholds in order to shrink down that map, I guess, or that
So
vicinity?
that's one option. So if you look, I believe EJ Screen uses an 80th percentile value. Once again, that's compared to the nation, not necessarily the county, but the higher the percentage, it basically means that it has a higher score for whatever criteria you're looking at, right? So if you're looking at something that's the 90th percentile, it means only 10% is worse than that, right? So if we start at 50%, I think it doesn't leave a lot of room for really honing in, if that makes sense.
Okay, and so that's the percentile. So do you think that would solve the problem, or is there other things that need to be done?
You mean from a screening perspective or from a?
Well, we're here to try to decide exactly what we're going to do.
Mhm.
And I believe that you stated that what the petitioners are proposing is way too much and too burdensome. And what I'm asking you
Mhm.
is to try to come up with some sort of a compromise so we can solve this problem with these overburdened communities. And that's what my question is. What would you do if you were the emissions god?
I think that's a great question. And not being the emissions god, I'll try the best I can to answer that. But I think, so one of the overall approaches is, so earlier I talked about Title V sources, right? And that Title V threshold right now is 100 tons per year. if you look at an area that is a non-attainment, so for example, whether it's marginal, severe, or whatever, the actual threshold for becoming a Title V source decreases, right? It can be 50 tons per year, it can be 25 tons per year. I think in South Coast, it might be 12 or 12 and a half tons per year, and that facility is a major source, right? So perhaps there's a solution that involves looking at redefining overburdened community, identifying, which ones from a county perspective are really a high level or ones to target. And then from there, going through a process and saying, maybe it's just these counties or these areas that need to go through an additional control technology evaluation or additional modeling requirements. But I think requiring that on pretty much throughout the county is pretty onerous, if that makes sense.
Okay, and just one more last question. Again, I note that the map that was provided by the petitioners encompasses almost all of Bernalillo County. Would it be preferable to change the standards for the entire state, or would you prefer to pinpoint particular areas? I mean, would they accomplish the same thing?
So when you say change the standards, what are you referring to?
Well, the standards of pollutants, the amount.
Yeah, sure. So I think it would be difficult to do that on a county level. And I'll also note that like other states, New Mexico has developed its own New Mexico ambient air quality standards, which are more stringent than federal standards, which we have to demonstrate compliance with. So I believe, and not 100% sure on this regulation, but I believe it's under the purview of I think it's 20.11.8 maybe, where there's the ability to set additional standards or change those. And so I think that might be, to your point, an option, but I think it is probably best to look at specific communities first.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to group these. I wrote some of them when I read, and now I'm writing them now. Anyway, wasting time. We'll start with BACT and other control technology. Would you say BACT is a well-established method to reduce air pollutants and therefore improve public health?
I would say yes, with the caveat that it's because it is an onerous process, is typically only reserved for major sources of pollution. Yeah.
Okay. Are major sources of, you said that that EHD requires Title V and PSD sources to use BACT in new and modified permits. Well, Title V is not a new mod.
Just PSD.
An NSR. Just PSD,
Just
not
PSD.
Title V.
No. Sorry.
Just PSD in our jurisdiction.
Mhm.
Is that the same with the state?
Yes.
The state only requires BACT for PSD.
Yes,
permits.
there are some states, for example, like Texas or California, that have state level BACT programs. Those have not been established in New Mexico or in the county.
Can you tell me in other states with state level BACT programs, is BACT something that's applied to what types of permits then?
So I wouldn't be 100% sure on that. So I would say 99% of my permitting experience is in New Mexico. So Scott has direct experience in California, so he might be more qualified to answer that question.
Okay, we'll ask Scott about California BACT. Thanks. So you'd say that hospitals then don't use BACT or any other standards currently because they're not PSD sources?
Hospitals?
Yeah, in New Mexico.
So what I will say is they are not required to under the regulations. Whether or not a hospital says we want to install a ultra low NOx burner for our boilers because we want to be champions of health is a decision that they can make, but it's not required unless they have a PSD permit.
Do you consult with any hospitals in the state?
Yes.
Do they use BACT?
As far as I'm concerned, they haven't gone through a BACT process, no.
Should I be calling it BACT?
Sorry, I sometimes use it interchangeably.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many staff are at Trinity?
Company-wide, about 2,000.
How many staff are in New Mexico? Sorry, how many staff could, are in work on New Mexico permitting?
Specifically in New Mexico, I would say in our office, 7.
Great. Sorry, I've moved away from BACT now, as you can tell. Let's see. So you mentioned in your written testimony, maybe now, that a couple ways in which it would be, well, you mentioned a couple monitors and monitoring by the city, specifically PM 2.5 monitors that we use in modeling, or that the city uses in modeling. Not me anymore. How many VOC monitors are there currently?
I think there's only one monitor, and it's a Del Norte one that monitors VOC. And I don't know the specific constituents that it monitors.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that one is a good is representative of the entire city?
I think it's challenging because from a modeling perspective, since we don't currently model VOCs, the EHD doesn't have kind of as much of a reason to have a VOC monitor in every single area. So I think that's a current monitor for NO2. I think they have a mobile trailer too that they're trying to get more data on. But I don't think from a VOC perspective that it would necessarily be representative of everything.
Believe it or not, I've been on the board long enough that I watched that go in, which isn't that long. It was like 2 years ago. Oh, I've lost my spot. Apologies. So you mentioned other control technology, layer MACT, required in non-attainment areas. And is it correct that currently the EPA hasn't designated Albuquerque as a non-attainment area?
Yes, it's not currently a non-attainment area.
What are is it correct that that the values of air pollution for ozone are within 95% of the ozone non-attainment standard?
I believe that's the case for multiple locations in New Mexico.
Yeah, and Albuquerque being one of them, Albuquerque, Bernalillo County being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if those standards are required in a non-attainment area and we are close to potentially becoming a non-attainment area, are you aware of the status of potential new ozone regulation, new ozone standards?
Yeah, so what I'll say, and correct me and stop me if this is not what you're getting at, but so for example, like the southeastern part of the state, and there's 7 counties, I believe, that are with 95% of the standard. New Mexico Environment Department has developed an ozone precursor rule to address those. And so primarily from oil and gas sources, addressing NOx and VOC, and it requires additional control technologies, stringent monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements associated with that.
I'm asking about our jurisdiction,
Mm-hmm.
though. I believe our jurisdiction is within, and you can correct me here, within 95% of the standard, that we've hit over some of those levels, the 8-hour standard or whatever, enough times that if the EPA administrator wanted to, they could designate us non-attainment.
So it would have to be an official determination from EPA, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we were to be designated non-attainment, would layer and MACT be required for a number of sources in Albuquerque?
So layer is only required for major sources. So that would be the 3 that currently have PSD permits. And now we would change from PSD to non-attainment NSR permitting. And one of the key differences between layer and BACT is that you're not allowed to consider cost with layer. It's just the lowest achievable emission rate, regardless of cost. RACT is specific to those sources that are existing already going through that process, but still only non-attainment areas.
Right. So you mentioned BACT being a complicated process to figure out. Is there a website that shows what one might use for BACT, that's publicly available?
So EPA maintains a database called RBLC, Rack Backed Layer Clearinghouse. And so what that is it's basically a compendium of all different sources in the United States that have gone through PSD or non-attainment NSR permitting. And it will specifically say for every single emission source that was subject to BACT, what the overall control technology is, and then what the emission limit is proposed as a result of going through that process.
So if you were looking at someone's permit and they had to put, they had a BACT requirement, and wouldn't it be easy enough to, how long would it take you to figure out that BACT requirement?
Yeah, so I think one of the key issues to mention here is that, you know, based on my experience, I can tell a client pretty early on, based on a control technology, what they're going to have to do in terms of installing BACT, like what it's going to look like at the end of the day, right? The work associated with it is the justification of that. So every time we do BACT, it's typically about 200 pages long, and it includes an analysis of every single source, because we have to justify and say during every single step, for example, what the overall control technologies are, why it is infeasible. In other words, it's not enough to say we're going to install a low NOx burner. We have to say we've also considered flue gas recirculation in addition to that, ultra low NOx, good combustion practices, all of these different things. And then say at the end of the day, we're going to choose this one. If we're not going to choose that one, we have to say why from a cost perspective. And so there's cost calculations involved with that as well.
Okay. Or do you ever use the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's BACT clearinghouse?
So we've referenced it, but in New Mexico, for example, everything we do with NMED has to be its own individual BACT evaluation. So we can say
that's what's required at NMED.
Yes. So we can say Texas BACT is X, Y, and Z for a specific pollutant, but we still have to go through that process here.
Do you think that Texas BACT is a good standard?
I haven't done enough work in Texas to comment on that.
Okay. I think I'm almost done. Oh, I have one more question about EHD isn't here, but this is a question, since you've done a lot of these permits, I feel that you may have some information here.
Yeah.
So the design value for say ozone, if we are not requiring controls for most sources, except for major sources where they pollute a lot, so it makes sense that maybe they need to have a control. And we don't have controls, so maybe let's say that the level is 3. I'm going to use really simple numbers here. And so we have 1, 2, and 3, and then we're at 3, and that's our design value. If we had each unit controlled to half, could we have more permits?
I don't think I'm fully understanding the question.
I'm trying to get at, it seems to me that EHD's permitting regime has almost a, because there aren't required controls currently, it means that if there were more controls, we could have more businesses that have permits, right? So each one had half instead of 1. They weren't polluting at their full amount, they were polluting controlled. And so I'm curious if that makes sense to you. If we had more requirements, more BACT requirements, the design value with a model, right? It would mean that you didn't go over the limit.
Yeah.
With more permit applications, more permitted sources.
Okay. So I'll try to summarize. Let me know if I'm off base.
Okay.
So you're saying if a background concentration, or excuse me, background monitor is recording a concentration of 10, for example, that's reflecting the surrounding sources around it. And so if we were to cut emissions from those sources, that background concentration would be less, and new facilities would have more increment in terms of being able to compare to the standard.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah. I think that would be an accurate assumption. Basically, and you can think about it this way, like I said before, if the South Valley monitor is 9.1 and the Foothills monitor is 5.1, then a facility is going to have a little bit more leeway if they locate closer to the foothills monitor in terms of what they can compare to the standard.
Okay, so in that case, a control technology regulation, I'm not talking about the whole regulation now, I'm just talking about backed, or let's just say backed for now, may actually may actually allow for more air permits while decreasing air pollution.
So I think it's a little bit more complicated.
Or at least
than that.
equivocating on air pollution.
Yeah. So one of the things is, and I think that is important to note, is that we have facilities that are Part 41 permits that have very advanced control technologies because they need to in order to pass air dispersion modeling, right? Which is a key distinction between unmitigated and mitigated. So
PTE.
yeah, so if you were to look at a facility that already is reducing emissions by 90%, even though it's not a PSD major source, you would get a minimal return on investment in terms of adding additional control technologies on that.
But is that required now?
Is what required?
That 99%.
So if you look at the denial criteria in the existing permitting path, it says EHD can't issue a permit if they exceed the NACs. And so that's why most facilities will install controls, is to reduce their emissions so that they're below the applicable standards. That's one of the main drivers for.
So it's not a requirement though to install those controls.
If they didn't, they wouldn't have a permit.
Do we know how? Okay. If they didn't, they wouldn't have a permit.
In other words, EHD wouldn't issue a permit to a permittee submitting an application saying they were in violation of the NACs.
And are those new permits you're talking about, or modifications in general?
So modifications in the state also require air dispersion modeling. So it would be modifications and new permits.
Are there older sources that don't have that control technology because they're not worried about exceeding the NACs?
So an existing source, for example, will still have to go through an air dispersion modeling analysis for all of its sources if it exceeds the SIL, right? So if I have a source from 1970.
Sorry, the back up the SIL?
SIL, a significant impact level.
Okay.
So if I have a source from, an old source from 1970 and it's proposing a modification, if the result of modeling that modification shows that it's an exceedance of that significant impact level, the facility then has to model all of its sources.
Remind me how that significant impact level relates to the standard.
So the SIL is, think of it as a screening level for modeling. In other words, if I go through a significance analysis and I'm below the SIL, I can stop the analysis there. I don't have to go add background concentrations or compare to the NACs or anything like that.
And but that doesn't explain the SIL to me. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So for example, the PM 2.5 NACs is 12.
Right.
The significant impact level is 0.2. So if a facility models and the impacts are less than 0.2, it's below the significant impact level. It doesn't have to go into a cumulative analysis. But those screening levels or those SILs, if you will, are stringent in terms of their low numbers, right? Most of the time, most of the analysis I do, I would say 90+%, especially for new facilities, existing facilities still require that cumulative analysis.
Okay, last question. Would a backed requirement be a burden on companies that already use backed for meeting the
So I think the control technology itself is different than the process of going through backed, if that makes sense.
I understand. Okay, yeah, I understand. Having the control technology, not the process.
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Just having the if they already have backed, if they've already installed backed, I assume it's not a burden to have backed.
No, if a facility already has the best available control technology, then going through the process would just be more of jumping through hoops than anything else.
Do you have a sense of a percentage of facilities that do that?
That a percentage of facilities that have
general sense of how many facilities already use backed and how many don't?
Well, I could tell you right now that the 3 PSD facilities do. Other than that, I don't know off the top of my head how many would be using, the best available control technology.
No, not even like a quarter, a half, 75% or 100%. Not
I
100%,
I
obviously.
couldn't say. What I could say is that most sources that are using that are synthetic minor sources, right, are those that are located in areas where they have stringent modeling increments they need to demonstrate compliance with. Will have some type of control technology, but it may not be backed level, if that makes
But a
sense.
synthetic minor source, correct me if I'm wrong, a synthetic minor source doesn't have to re-up, it's not a Title V source anymore, so it doesn't have a 5-year operating permit. Although I guess this doesn't apply to Title V sources, does it?
No, it does not.
Right.
But synthetic minor sources would have been Title V sources had they not taken a reduction either in emissions or things like that. So they're often the ones that have more advanced controls.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I may have more questions tomorrow.
Perfect timing for a break of the day. Mr. Salente, we will resume tomorrow morning at 8:30. The board will continue their questioning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.